Hi. Can you hear me?
Hello, we've been joined by Andy as well. Hi, Andy.
Yeah, oh, wild. Andy's appeared. That was just like perfect timing. So, hello, everyone. Welcome to Beside the Rookery.
Or as Mark almost suggested, we call it Between Two Rooks.
Indeed.
or deeper inside the rookery, but that's a whole other conversation.
Let's just not. You don't need to see our private chats, trust me.
It's true. So what are we talking about this evening? Well, this evening, based on, well, we've got an announcement later on, and because of the nature of that announcement, we decided that we would pick a question and a discussion of the Discord server to talk about tonight. So this is how it started. Let me just bring that up on the screen.
Of course.
So I have a question for everyone. What would wizardry have been like before the schools of magic were founded? Would they have been witches with multiple lores as some form of BtR, or would they have been just using witchcraft and no access to colour magic?
So obviously,
a discussion ensued.
as is often the case with these things. So obviously we're discussing Warhammer. If you hadn't already gathered that this evening, we're discussing Warhammer magic. The topic in particular that popped up was Hedge Witches, because Hedge Witches are, in terms of how they were presented in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2nd edition and in 4th edition, quite misunderstood, and exactly where they fit inside the whole Winds of Magic, Colour, Teclis's teaching, the colleges of magic, the magic that lies in the old world outside of the standard model that we're not used to normally seeing in the battle game. And the discussion that ensued on the Discord made it quite clear that some people understood bits, but not necessarily all. And we thought it might be quite nice to just discuss and go in depth with that a little bit. But to just reiterate what Lindsay said earlier, we do have an announcement which any fan of...
Be careful what you say, because His Imperial Majesty has joined us.
Hedge Witches don't exist. They never did exist. And that's just the way that it is. Hello there, Carl Franz. Always nice to see you.
I'd be more worried if it was a Grand Theogenist, then we'd really have to be careful.
Then we probably wouldn't even be talking. Yes, we do have an announcement for the end of the stream, which we'll briefly discuss. Before then, loosely, if you're a fan of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, I think you're going to quite enjoy this particular announcement that we've got coming up. But beyond that, I shall now pass back to whomever. Lindsay, that way?
Yep, certainly. And the Flip Top then... they followed up with Flip Top then clarifies, I'm wondering about systems and mechanics more than the lore, mainly as I have a game set around 15... That looks like 15,000. Oh no, 1502 IC. I was
the old I1 thing.
Yeah. I1, yeah. Anyway, that's where it started. This is how it's going. Shall we have a chat about witches versus hedge witches, why they're confused, and where can we find more information about hedge witches?
Okay, I'll start with the opening on this one. Hedge Witches were first introduced to Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay as something distinct from just being a crazy wizard that casts spells without having been taught them in the past, or a witch, or something similar. In Shades of Empire back in about 2008, I wrote 2 articles for that book, one about Hedge Witches, the subject of the day, and one about the Imperial Navy. It was a book that was put together by FFG when Games Workshop stopped producing the 2nd edition of Warhammer, and it moved over to a new licenser. It was put together because I was asked to think of some unique factions that had never really been covered before in Warhammer, that were intrinsically Warhammer. And one thing that is intrinsically Warhammer is that witches exist. Everybody knew they existed. It wasn't the only articles I pitched. It wasn't just the Navy, and it wasn't just Hedge Witches. I also pitched nobles, interestingly, as a faction. But we can discuss old things that never got written at another time. And Hedge Witches were added so that we could take a look at what magic might look at if Teclis hadn't come along and said, magic is this way, you human beings, and repositioned all of the human magic into a very strict form. And this is an older form that lasted from before that time.
And I think one thing to remember about WFRP is that the elves are not innocent agents in all this. So sometimes there is stuff that is in WFRP from the point of view of elves that is not necessarily an unmotivated or objective agenda.
Tecla's an unreliable narrator.
But
That's
he's an
the words I was
unreliable
looking for.
narrator.
I knew you would find them
Absolutely.
for me.
Teclis liked humans in the way that anyone would like a large buffer against chaos over on your eastern border, which is exactly what they were. And they were going to get destroyed in the Great War against chaos without their help. So just 3 high elf mages came along, Teclis, Yurtle, and Finreir, and they completely reconstructed everything magical in the Empire. And the Hedge Witches were one of the many casualties of that, as were other types of magic, which have been well discussed in many different books, whether that's the role-playing game or whether that's various novels that have discussed other types of magic that exist out
And
there.
on Discord today, there was a lot of chat about the Druids and the great families of Druids, part of which 2/3 or something became the Jade College and 1/3 said no thanks and left for the forests.
On that, I think you've got to add a heavy...
Apparently.
And that was in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2nd edition. You'll find that each edition of Warhammer approaches all of its facets of lore through the lens of whatever Warhammer is on the day. So back in 2006, when I wrote the sections that covers in the Tome of Salvation, that was very clearly how it was. The old Druids, the old faith, had been approached by Teclis, and he had said to them, hey, you see these big Oghams that you've been worshipping for the last however many thousand years? This is what they actually are. And he showed them that they were the original waystones that the elves had put down a very, very long time ago to help create the Great Vortex against chaos. The Great Vortex, that siphoned all magic from the world and stopped demons being able to pop up any old place. So he completely changed the great Druidic families. Now, did he change their beliefs? Well, as the 2nd edition version of it put, 1/3 of them walked away from that and said, yeah, I don't think so. 2/3 stayed, and even the 2/3 stayed still maintained all their Druidic beliefs. They just did it through a completely different lens now. Instead of saying it is coming from the gods, they said it's coming from the Jade Wind, whether they believed that or not. And as generations went by, the old teaching still went on. If you take a look at any of the various Jade wizards, they do not look like wizards, they look like druids, and that's the large reason for that. They continued on with their practices, the Jade Wind being a particularly fertile wind anyway, so it fit very closely with what the Druidic lifestyle was.
Yeah, so there was a lot of chat about Druids, but the particular thing we wanted to talk about was Hedge Witches. How do they differ from the witch career, say in 4th edition? Yeah, that's...
So I'll finish up with my preamble and all those things. The Hedge Witches were added to 4th to try and broaden out what was the academic wizard on one side in the academic section, and the very illegal, wrong witch, who was someone who had learned magic dirtily, either because they were naturally talented in magic and they just figured it out themselves, or perhaps they had a master who had been taught out in the periphery of imperial society. And again, we're probably channeling all manner of nasty stuff. We've got hocus pocus, hexes, and all the rest of it coming out of them, where the Head Witches were dropped into the village peasant backgrounds class, meaning that they were a far more acceptable version of what hedge witchery might look like out there, and that's why they were added. So we had 3 different facets: bad witches, rural witches, who were practicing old traditions, and academic witches who were practicing the proper collegiate magic that you would get from the colleges of magic, obviously. So they were added because we wanted to make sure that all the 3 primary pillars of human magic was in place. But is that the vast sum of everything? Absolutely not. There's all different types of magic out there. Warhammer World is huge and can accommodate almost anything as long as you view it through a Warhammer lens. I mean, take a look at the addition of the Ice Witches when Kislev came along, for example. They were completely different to anything else that had been popping along, including color magic. They came along with a nice little deck of spells. Ice Wizards, away we go in the old Empire army list. And in a similar fashion, that's how the Hedge Witches were added. They're, strictly speaking, not even witches, but we can cover that if we go into any of the details. So there's my preamble. Done.
Apparently Red Dice Games says, I heard Head Witches and now I want some scumble.
Who doesn't like a good head witch? I mean, that, in many respects, it sounds like some form of some form of I'm using mind magic-y type witch. Never a good. I mean, very close to Greys. So where will we begin? Andy, I think it's worth mentioning directly now, since he's not said anything yet. Andy wrote large chunks of, most of, in fact, the magic sections in the 4th edition of Warhammer. And that included the update to the Hedge Witches. So he had to rumble back into the ancient depths of 2nd edition's versions of what Hedge Witches were. And I pinged him over all those bits and pieces and said, go wild, as we inevitably do. So he'll probably have quite a few opinions on this particular subject too.
Indeed. Though don't, if there's bits you don't like about 4th edition Magic, don't blame me. Those are not my fault. All the bits you love, that was me. All the bits you don't love, not so much. And if we run out of things to talk about later, I can talk about one of the things I mentioned in Discord about a way I would do differently now. But anyway, but no, I think it's a fascinating question. Not just the Hedge Witches, because obviously the book, any of these editions, like obviously, as you say, Andy, it's representing what's in the Warhammer game at that point, but it's also representing where it is in the calendar at that point. So obviously 4th edition is 2512, which is earlier than where 2nd edition was, and before all the Storm of Chaos and all that kind of jazz. And I think the question of what it would have been like before is interesting, because the Hedge Witch tradition and everything we talk about that is this very long and sort of storied sort of tradition, but there would have been others out there in the Empire, and for me, like, it's a really interesting academic exercise to think, well, what are the incontrovertible truths, not the Teclisian truths, but the things are true. Like, the winds of magic are real, right? There is magic blowing down. Now, how you perceive that, and how you then therefore use that, is sort of different. And I think, without wanting to stray too much on some wicked plans I have for the Rookery for the future, I think the idea of schools of magic and paradigms of magic is quite interesting. And I always thought, like, as a little academic exercise, I think this was in 2nd edition actually, rather than 4th edition. I'm a big fan of Excalibur, the movie Excalibur, the John Boorman King Arthur movie. And I tried to work out how you could make a wizard career that was Merlin from that. And it was interesting, right? Because there's shades of Ulgu in there, but then there's maybe a little Actuary in there, and there's actually maybe a little Celestial in there as well, in terms of seeing the future. And it was quite good fun to kind of imagine a school of magic that saw he saw all through the prism of, it was the dragon, and it was the dragon's breath, and it was the dragon's fire, and it was the dragon. So it's almost much like with the Hedge Witches, much like with the Druids, there's almost a spiritual component to it as well, as a way of, in practice, they'd be channeling these different winds, and there'd be greater risk of corruption and so on with that. But equally, they're not channeling Dar. They're not doing anything actively evil. And I think it's a fun thing for GMs to kind of play with. So.
Yeah, and I think for me, there's also the consideration that before the time of Magnus, there was literally thousands of years. Mm-hmm. And exactly. Witches or people that cast magic hadn't been exterminated. They did exist because Teclis called them, and they came. And interestingly, the Shadows of Empire article does talk about that the Hedge Witches, the Blessed Few, distinguished themselves from the Illusionists, the Shadowmancers, the Elementalists, the Druids, as somehow different, somehow more pure, and actually even less dark than them. So yeah. I always think that with Warhammer, you have to think about that. Well, how has it been for thousands of years? And they've been tolerated somehow in communities for that time.
Yeah. One of the aspects of Hedge Wizardry that was quite strongly reinforced back in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2nd edition was that they themselves believed that they were blessed, that they were the blessed few. And whilst they were the cunning folk, the people who lived out on the periphery, on the hedge between civilization and the wilds, they were the only, as they pitched themselves, the only defenders against what lay beyond, which immediately put them into conflict with some of the major cults, particularly after the arrival of all the tribes into the Reich Basin, where you had, say, for example, the Talites, who claimed that the wild places were holy to Tal. And they were the ones that could bravely walk through the wild places and be safe. And the Tulutans, the original tribe that worshipped Tal, if you wish to simplify it in such a fashion, they Well, they were relatively warlike, much like most of the early tribes. So when it came along to folk saying things like, well, we're the ones that protect from the wild, they were very quick to come along and kick them in. And that also was the case with, say, the cult of Ulrich. They were also pretty warlike. And then the incoming cult of Sigmar, who were also all about defending their people from the depredations of chaos and whatever lay out there. So immediately put them into conflict. But that didn't change the rural lifestyles that these people were driven out to, where there was no great priests or anything similar speaking on their behalf, because these were tiny little pockets of civilization spread throughout the Right Basin. And this is where the hedge folk continue to thrive, where they continue to protect their people and were known for all those things that you generally have mixed up with witches: potions and filters, and little ways of healing, childbirth, all manner of just day-to-day life stuff. They were the doctors, for want of a better description, and they lived out in the hut at the edge of the wood, and they protected all the people from the worst of it. And then, of course, as time came on, Sigmar, other cults came along, and slowly but surely they were pushed back and out.
We do have a question in the comments, which I thought was worth going to, because you mentioned it earlier about people displaying magical potential. So lore or rules-wise, how does someone display magic potential without having the language magic skill for casting?
Do I jump on that one, Andy?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's two very different things there. I think, like, lore-wise, like, I mean, generally speaking, by manifesting something magical, like, that's pretty consistent in all of the Warhammer stuff, like, be that the WFRP stuff or be that the actual novels or things. You know, strange things happen, you know, around them, which is them on some level harnessing the kind of winds and whatnot. Mechanically, there's no real way to represent that, because you can't cover everything with mechanics, and it would be insane if you tried to. But that might be a thing. Again, like, I'm a big fan of collusion between players and GM. So if you know you've got a character who's going to become magical, who's going to enter the wizard career, if you are having that conversation with the GM, then weird stuff can start happening. And maybe, you know, occasionally he lets you just roll an intelligence test and something interesting happens, probably something bad, until you actually get that kind of the training that you need. But I do know it's something that certainly in our games, there was always a sense that people had that potential, and that certain wizards had the capacity to notice that potential and spot that potential before even manifestations had started happening. And I know that mechanically, one of the ways that Andy did it in our, I don't think this was in second edition, I think it was in your adaptation of it, Andy, wasn't it? That it was to do your fate points. That essentially that was kind of what your fate points represented. Anyone with fate points had the potential to become a wizard. Not necessarily would become one, but had the potential.
And that was the rationalization of how it manifested without having the language magic skill for casting. Every time you used a fortune point, you were manipulating the world around you in a minor way.
Yeah.
So that's an option.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're looking at hard mechanics and you're looking at what the rules of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay offer, the rules say that every single PC can, if they wish to do so, move into the wizard career, which means that every single PC potentially can become a wizard. Now, how you rationalize that within your own games is entirely up to yourselves. For example, in our games, that was typically down to, well, they all had the spark of magic within them. In many respects, perhaps that's why they had fate points. Not necessarily the only reason why. You could also argue that perhaps divine intervention comes in or something else. So perhaps there's something sitting on their shoulder, looking over them and protecting them. That doesn't need to be something good. That can be something bad. Just because you have fate points, you're destined for something, doesn't mean that you're destined for something that anyone should really be proud of. But one way of rationalizing what that was to say that they all had the spark of magic within them. And to move back to the hedge folk, they have a very specific belief. They believed that they had been blessed by a god. Now, that god differed depending on where you came from. If you came from the north, they believed it was Haletha, one of the fertility gods. If you came from Middenland or somewhere around there, they generally believed it was Renald, and they referred to them as the cunning folk. Because they were particularly tricksy and they very much stood out against the local Ulrichans, which is why you could see why they were pushed out to periphery by the Ulrichans. Renald suddenly became important to them because Renald is often seen as antithetical in some respects to the far more simple and direct Ulrich. And regardless of where you came in the Empire, they all had their own stories for why they were picked out. They were blessed. And all of their ritual, which is deep And if you read the article in the second edition, you see just how deep some of the ingredients that you require to cast a spell are particularly difficult to get hold of, like a knife that was buried during a black moon for a full 3 weeks and then plucked out. And you can only cast a spell if you have that. A particular thorn in a particular fashion. You have to literally press it into your thumb or the spell doesn't work. And all of those ingredients are part and parcel of them not suffering in the same fashion that most other wizards do, particularly the untrained or the pre-techless colleges of magic style of magic, where there's always going to be dark. There's going to be dark magic, a blending of magic which has got some sort of, for want of a better analogy, exhaust. And those exhaust fumes are pulling out of wizards who are not as well trained. And then they're going to be getting curses or whatever you want to call magical mishaps popping up all over the place. Where the Blessed Few sort of avoided large chunks of that, and you'll note that that has been married through into 4th edition as well, where the Blessed Few actually use magic like priests. If you look at the rules of the pair of them, they're working very similarly. All the casting numbers for the spells for the Blessed Few are 0, in the same fashion that the priests have got effectively 0 for all their casting numbers, for all their miracles and their blessings. They're a bridge that sits between the two different rule sets.
So here's a question from
just briefly, I remember as part of the design, just the moment when we had that epiphany of that's how we would do it. Like in terms of like looking behind the scenes at the design process, like we were going, how do we capture the fact that they're different? And that moment, well, if the casting number 0, it's effectively the same, isn't it? That was a good day.
It was.
So hedge mages remind me a lot of the witches from Terry Pratchett. Is there some inspiration going on here?
Shared.
It's probably more both drawing from the same source, right?
Yeah, both drawing from the same source. Exactly. It's shared ancestors in this particular instance, where we're not related to chimpanzees, but we both have a shared ancestor. And whilst I see an alien coming down to Earth may look at a human and a chimpanzee and go, well, they look kind of similar, don't they? They're basically the same thing. And if you look at their genetics, they are. In the same fashion, hedge mages and the similar witches from Terry Pratchett are in a similar fashion. I would also say, though, if you're looking for one that is directly influenced by Terry Pratchett, you're far better looking at the hags that popped up in the Kislev book in 2nd edition. The hags, whilst not directly influenced, are strongly influenced by the witches that you find in Terry Pratchett, although they've got a very different background and a very different position inside society, and they draw from the old Russian Baba Yaga style witches as much as they draw from anything else.
But there's a certain pragmatism to their understanding of metaphysics, which very much feels like the witches from Terry Pratchett. So absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I like best about hedge mages and hedge witches is the way in which the witch stereotype, right, is problematic because of the actual real world history of witch trials and how deeply kind of pernicious and patriarchal and just awful that whole thing like was. And on the one hand, if you're offering a fantasy game, you have to play into those tropes because people expect it. So you have to allow evil witches because that's a thing people expect in fantasy games. But equally, you want to go some level to kind of address the fact that there are kind of wise women and wise folk who are part of their community who are taking risks to try and help them, who just know things a little bit better, but are maybe standing outside the norm and are therefore resented by the kind of local authorities or whatever, which is essentially the true history of kind of witch trials. So I like the fact that we allowed for those kind of characters and those kind of stories to be told. I think that's something I'm quite proud of.
I think it's quite important as well. The original Blessed Few article, the Hedge Witch article, made it quite clear that the majority of hedge witches had no magic. They were of the families, in a similar fashion, the great families of druids had passed on the traditions down from one generation to the next. And the ones who were blessed, the actual blessed few, the ones who could cast, were the ones that learned the magic. But all of the knowledge that they had was not limited to just the ones who could cast magic. So the how to create a dagger of the art, or how to create a particular thorn that worked in a particular way, that was passed down generation to generation to generation down through the families. And when one could actually empower that with magic, because they were blessed, they were one of the blessed few, they were the ones that then got to cast the spells. They were the ones who could Murkride, move into the realm that lay between reality and what beyond.
Makes them in a way similar to priests, because that concept is just absolutely normal in a religion. You've got priests that are blessed and they pray, and you've got priests that aren't blessed and they pray too. And actually, you can't really tell the difference until something miraculous happens, and that's quite a similar concept. Yeah.
Although I think that's one of the things that if we were doing with 4.5, like that's one of the things I think we'd need to play up a bit more, because it's interesting through conversations in Discord and Twitter how many people have kind of missed that quite important detail that is in there, that not all priests have the potential to summon or manifest blessings and miracles and things. It is a rare few. It's there, it's written there. It just doesn't slap people in the face with it, so people sometimes miss it. And
again, it's a point of difference in different versions of Warhammer as well, because in some versions of Warhammer they almost play it like D&D. Every priest is sitting there doing holy miracles and bringing down the lights from the heavens. Where people are playing, particularly those who started with Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay First Edition, they are often looking at it from the vast majority of priests are not necessarily charlatans, that's far too strong, but they're most certainly not blessed. The blessed priests are super, super few. There might be only 1 or 2 or 3 of them in any particular locale, and even then, they're rare. And the blessed priests, the one where the gods literally channel through them, are important. They are super important. They're the ones that all the other priests are jealous of. They're the other ones that they have to turn to and possibly stab a knife in the back of, because they can do it. And it's a more Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 1 feel than, say, for example, where Warhammer moved as it moved past its 3rd and 4th edition into its later editions, where they were often going for the big. And you were looking at the top level, most capable characters in the war game, and many people translated to that to be, well, everybody in Warhammer must be like that. And slowly but surely, the fantasy roleplay games changed.
Yeah, I think though. I mean, we're all priests in 1st edition, not magic users, though.
You could argue, yes, they were.
I thought they were, because I think the problem is because of the way
they weren't.
Yeah, the fiction. No. But I think it's part of that thing to do with like career progression and stuff. If magic is a stat that you must increase to go up a level of the career, therefore everybody who goes up in that career is a magic user. One of the nice things about what we did with careers in 4th edition was you didn't have to take everything in the higher levels. So Absolutely. You could progress up and you could become a high priest. You could become the top level priest, the most important priest in the empire with all of these stats, but you just never took those talents. So you never manifested the kind of ability. And I thought that was, again, it's a very clever design decision.
So Vagrant 456 says, I find it hard to get players to understand how rare it is to have true blessings / miracles when they're so cheap to purchase rules-wise. If you had to do over, would you make it harder to get? Are they that cheap to purchase?
They are pretty cheap. And I would,
the first one.
What I would suggest is that you modify the language on what a PC is rather than modify the language on what the world is. All the PCs are super special in Warhammer. There's no other way around it. They all have fate points. They're not normal people. Look at the fate point rules. These guys and these gals are just not normal. They can fall off cliffs and survive. They can walk into a gambling hall and win every bet because they have fortune points. They are manipulating the world around them, if you want to just look at it on a basic, hard rule front, in a way that nobody else is doing. And this has been the case since 1st edition. In 2nd edition, it got reinforced because they were concerned about... I'll let Chris Pramus himself discuss exactly what he was concerned about regarding those rules. But it's fair to say that there was a lot of whiff. I.e., you did tests and you failed. You did tests and you failed. Fortune points, to a degree, mitigated that. But they also changed how characters interact with the world. And one of the easiest ways to accept all of these changes is to either have an external influence giving those characters benefits, or the character themselves is super special. Even if they're a beggar sitting in the street, missing one of their legs and barely able to speak Reichspiel, they're still special. They've got a fate of some sort. And one of the easiest and quickest ways to rationalize that is to say they've been laced through with the winds of magic because they've been sitting on the Warhammer world for a very long time, and they've got the spark of magic within them. And whether they realize it or not, they are channeling magic around them as they go. So while the beggar's sitting on the street and his mate across the road gets drummed off by the local watch, he doesn't, because he's passed an unexpected stealth test as he accidentally channels a little bit of Ulgu and re-rolls a failed test and passes it again and isn't spotted. That's one way of rationalizing these things.
And of course, another way would be they've been sort of touched by Sinch, but that's essentially the same thing. That's essentially the same thing, right?
Pretty much exactly the same thing.
Yeah, Andy and I took a break for this live stream to discuss WFRP magic from our discussion earlier on today of WFRP magic. And we were talking about the dwarf in first ed, weren't we?
The necromancer.
The necromancer, yeah.
Was that necromancer? Yeah, whichever one, yeah.
Yeah, and how...
Get his name.
Spoiler alert. I don't even know if... Is it an adventure? There's a description of how they had been somewhere and uncovered a Zinchian artifact. So what's the big mystery for how a dwarf could become a necromancer? Because, well...
Chaos
works in mysterious ways. Chaos. Anyway, I like to think that we've now all joined the Elves Anonymous support group. So we've all had experiences where we joined the cult of Ulthuan, and Karl Franz has particular experience of that himself, and he would like to ask the group, we feel for you. The first thing to realize is that they don't always tell the truth just because they look beautiful. Teclis claims that the gods don't actually channel through blessed priests and they are just a conduit of faith. Is Teclis misunderstanding this, or do priests actually require the gift?
Yes.
Oh.
So I wrote this section directly into the Tome of Salvation for second edition, where Teclis very much says that. Makes it very clear. Now, this wasn't an original idea on my front. I was duplicating what had already come beforehand from Warhammer Fantasy Battle. And I was repositioning it and recontextualizing it in the reality of what he was facing, which is an empire full of thousands and thousands of spellcasters, all of which are ill-disciplined, throwing dar out the place, all over the place. It's a mess, and having to try and turn these into very real battle wizards. He had no care about them being useful wizards. They only had one purpose as far as he was concerned, and that was to act as an army, and thus we have the college's foundation. Now, part of that is his, you could argue, misunderstanding regarding priests, or you could argue that he purposefully lied, or you could say he purposefully told the truth. One thing is certain, if we just say look at the Druids, the Waystones that had become the Oghams were Waystones. They just were. Now, whatever humans erected after the elves, their own version of the Oghams, that's a completely different kettle of fish. But the originals, the things that the Druids were worshipping, many of them, as ancient artifacts from an older style of magic, were not what they claimed them to be. So was Teclis right in that regard? Yes. Is it easy to hide a lie in the truth? Yes. Is it easy to actually have Teclis be telling the truth completely? Yes. I think the only thing I can conclude on this one is it's up to you for your game. Did Teclis lie or tell the truth? And I think you'll find that every version of Warhammer will present a slightly different version of the same tale. Now, obviously, with our new version of Warhammer that'll be coming out from Games Workshop soon, it's all pre-Teclis, and they might completely rewrite everything again. And that's half the fun of it, particularly from us as Warhammer Fantasy roleplay players. We can take a look at all the new types of magic that they introduce and go, how can they be incorporated into the great web of knowledge that we already have about how magic works? And particularly, say, Mordheim did exactly the same thing. And adapting what the magic was for Mordheim into the eventual model that became the colleges is, again, half the fun.
And we should maybe talk about the fact that the elves have a fundamentally different view of the world anyway. So what are, the Tower of Hoeth? Hoeth is a god. So, the magic of the elves has a link to the gods in a way that humans don't necessarily have.
they would almost say that. I mean, this distinction is almost irrelevant. It's a little bit like
Yes.
like if I can again, apologies, I'm about to spoil the movie Blade Runner. I sincerely hope most people are familiar with Blade Runner.
Oh my goodness, I hope so.
I haven't.
You hope so. You what really? You haven't seen it all the way through? Oh, for shame. Well, you know what the central question is that people always talk about in Blade Runner. To do with Deckard, right?
Yeah.
People always talk,
alert!
spoiler alert. People always talk about whether he is a replicant or not. And the point is, that isn't the important question to ask. The point is, it's to do with like, how can you tell what actually is human? That's the question. It isn't, was Deckard manufactured and then made to think he's human, or was Deckard a human who has just become soulless and kind of empty? Like, the mechanics of who he is are irrelevant. The point of that movie is, what is humanity? It's the wrong question. It's a matter of perspective. And I think it's a similar thing here. The distinction that we're arguing about is coming from a position that to an elf is actually irrelevant. Yeah,
that is in fact a better way of describing it than I was about to do. I was about to go find a quotation that I'd written in the second edition of Tome of Salvation, which basically said, "Hi, I'm an elf." A discussion between an elf and a wizard, and the wizard says, "Please explain what exactly is this very situation, the gods and magic, and what's the difference?" And the elf basically said that both versions were correct.
Because you've also, on top of that, got the question of language as well, which is that the Elven language is markedly more complex than Reichspiel, but they're having to dumb all the concepts down into this simpler language to try and explain it to these humans who also aren't fundamentally as smart, aren't as long-lived, don't have the same kind of conceptual spaces operating in their brain. So everything is necessarily a simplification. Like, not to patronize humanity in the old world, but if I'm explaining narrative voicey to a 10-year-old, I'm going to explain that differently than if I'm explaining to an 18-year-old or if I'm explaining it to a university graduate, right? You're going to come at that in a different level, use different terminology, different analogies, explain it in a different way. And the same is true, I think, of all knowledge. But
I also like the idea that Teclis was explaining it in a different way for different humans over time. So the words Teclis said that they understood when he came, they would get, through the use of his teachings, a fundamentally different understanding of those words generations later. And for an elf, it's perfectly acceptable to give a message in one generation that won't be decoded until a generation far into the future. Not because the words are different, but because those humans in the future have a fundamentally deeper understanding of language and will look back and go, "Oh, that's what he meant."
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, now that makes sense.
Also, the opposite is true potentially. That actually their misunderstanding may encode and change as their language evolves much more quickly because of the nature of humanity, and they end up going down a metaphysical cul-de-sac and fundamentally misunderstanding.
And I think both of those things are definitely the case, particularly because Teclis left several famous letters to the colleges of magic, which have been picked up in various books, which could very much lead to that sort of story potential for your games. If you wanted to look at oh my goodness, we've just developed another understanding of what Teclis means as a particular passage, you could do that and then have them, of course, misunderstand it entirely, because that's half the fun of these things.
And it's even further complicated by the fact that the way they, sorry, Lindsay, keep interrupting, but the fact that obviously they use language to cast magic, which is fundamentally altering the nature of the reality around them. So the more they learn this stuff and talk about this stuff, the more they actually change the metaphysics that are going on behind the scenes. That's
one of the joys of the lingua prestantia.
Exactly. It's a lovely, twisty lore thing, which means it does give you as a GM carte blanche to do ultimately whatever the hell you want, which is always good.
Yeah, quite. Because in the end, there are no Warhammer police bots going to come around your house and tell you how you have to play in your home. Because one of the things I've learned through going through cons is that every single group plays Warhammer differently. All of them. And they all think that their way is better than everybody else's in general, because that's why they play it that way. I mean, why wouldn't you think your version was better? Why would you play it that way if you didn't? And it's fascinating to see, because I've spoken to people who are die-hard Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 1. I will never use the colors of magic in my game players. And they've got vast reasons for why that's the case, and they're great. And equally, I've got diehard players who only know Warhammer through, say, the 8th edition of Warhammer, the battle game, and they've got a very strong sense of what the game should be because of that. And the lack of, say, things like, I don't know, demigryphs or whatever in 2nd edition just stuns them. They're like, what is this game? It's ridiculous. So everybody's own version of Warhammer is going to play at your table in your own way. Yeah, boo to color magic, quite. And there is no right way. It's what works best at your table.
I've just scooped this one up from the Discord while you were talking. Again, I didn't get an answer on how to pronounce this person's name. So Tots and Henny.
Yukimi?
I don't know. Yukimi, but I feel like I shouldn't be pronouncing part of the TSU bit. But anyway, Tots and Henny Yukimi asks, so who are the colleges of magic aligned to and loyal to, I wrote that wrong, in the present? Are they in effect or otherwise still elven enclaves?
I mean, it depends what you mean by loyal to, right?
Yeah.
I mean, aligned to, like ideologically, metaphysically, yeah, a bit. But who are they loyal to? The Empire? Sort
the
of?
Electric Council in particular.
Yeah.
The Electric Council in particular, if you run by the Articles of Magic.
But like there's who are they legally subordinate to and who are they actually loyal to?
Yeah.
And I think again, everybody's Warhammer is different. So if you want to have, kind of institutions as monoliths, great. But I'm much more interested in institutions as big groups of people and all of those people. So who is that wizard loyal to? Who is that wizard loyal to? Who is that wizard loyal to? And each one of those will probably have 2 or 3 people that they're loyal to. And I think that makes for a more interesting web. And some of the most fun politicking that we've done in any of our role-playing, even more so than in our Vampire the Dark Ages campaign, which is a pretty heavy political campaign. But the stuff we did in the Colleges of Magic was way more political than that. Way more political. Because you had all these factions. You had these 8 colleges, and then within each college you had multiple factions. And then you had friendships and alliances and relationships that crossed the colleges. And then you had all the people outside the college, like the faiths and the noble houses and all that kind of stuff as well. And it was just an incredibly dense
and
morass.
then you had secret societies that were in place to protect the colleges from within the colleges by the colleges. And
and all manner of... I'll add one particular detail that ties back to the original subject point as well. And to Shades of Empire, again, with the Hedge Witches. The Hedge Witches were infiltrating the Colleges of Magic because they were very keen to make sure the Colleges of Magic didn't come along. Indeed, Hedge Witches are, as presented in the 2nd edition, they don't like witches at all, or wizards, or any of those, because they attract attention to them. So they tended to be as against witches and wizards as your average cult of the Sigmar person might have been. They were infiltrating the colleges. They had
Fisher.
Marcus Fisher, who's marked as the NPC in there, who was a hedge folk grey wizard and one of the most talented grey wizards that there had been in a generation. But he also happened to be hedge folk. And was looking out for hedge folk. And when he found people who were one of the blessed few, he channeled them over to the hedge folk, not to the Colleges of Magic, which is where legally he should have been taking them. And there was a group of hedge wizards that were behind that and were in the colleges working together. And it's those little secret societies that keep things going. Similarly, in the Druidic side, one of the great families of druids that had joined the Jade College, in our game, the Grumfelds, and they were working out of Talipine. The Grumfelds, realizing the nature of magic over the course of generations, had infiltrated the other colleges. They weren't just in the Jade College. There was Grumfelds in the Amethyst College. There was Grumfelds in the Bright College. There was Grumfelds in the other colleges. And whilst most of them were Jade, almost all of them were Jade, including the matriarch at one point, if you take a little look at the book there. It's where the source of the family name for being one of the great families came from. Whilst that college was entirely controlled to a degree by the great families, they were also spreading out amongst the others in an attempt to ensure that their version of Druidism was not eradicated. So political factions within political factions, everybody having their own agenda, really does make a significant difference towards making it feel like a bigger, more real place, rather than this is the Bright College and they burn.
And we had some instances, so the Grunfelds had over the years become, I don't know if they'd started off a noble family of Talabheq land, right? So they also had their own loyalties to
They
that
moved up
family.
to that. They
They'd
were
moved
originally
up
a
to that,
great druidic
yeah.
family.
So then they were part of the politics of Talabheq land and the empire as a whole.
Yes.
And then you have, you know, wizards that come from noble families themselves who have that lingering, well, who are they loyal to? Is it their family? Are they now in the service of the emperor? What if their family is a strong rival to be, I don't know, the next Prince of Altdorf? Then you have all these questions, which is just like life. People have divided loyalties. So someone has asked, Smiling Tom has asked, a future talk about elves as PCs and fundamental differences in how they think.
Yeah, we I have opinions.
Of course you do. And we've talked a bit
Opinions.
about that on Discord. And I think
Yes, I
probably
have
that's
done.
something that's maybe underexplored in WFRP canon, actually.
I agree, actually. I mean, in the novels, it's been dealt with quite a lot. There's quite a lot of elven novels, but you tend to find that they often go down their pointy-eared humans in terms of their psychology, and they might dabble to a degree with them being different, but ultimately, for the novel to be engaging, they have to be sympathetic, which means that they often prey upon the very same drives that we as humans are particularly susceptible to ensure that the drama of the novel at hand lands. And that makes sense in the same way that over the course of multiple years, Space Marines became more and more human as they were more and more characterized in the various novels. With the very original versions of them, they were often little more than flesh robots controlled with all manner of different drugs and similar. And as they whittled away with that, with each different version of the novels or different versions of 40k, Space Marines became different. And in the same fashion, elves have too. But in the fantasy roleplay side, way back in the day, I was commissioned to do a second edition book for elves, but that was just before the license was moved from Games Workshop over to FFG. So that book obviously never came to pass because FFG didn't pick it up, and they moved to Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 3rd edition instead. But I'd already done a lot of work on that book, which is one of the reasons why I have so many opinions on elves, because I'd had to form them, because I had to start writing them all down. I had to start looking at all of the existing Games Workshop lore and thinking, how can I rationalize this and turn it into something that people can roleplay at the table?
Just before we come to Carl Franz's next question, as we give him guidance on imperial politics, I've always tried to steer players away from taking elves as PCs so I can play them a little more alien than possibly expected. And
yes, there was
a psychology article in White Dwarf, if I recall.
And brainwashing.
Carl Franz, Emperor of Mankind, chosen of Sigmar, asks, understandably given his position,
I'm loving this.
What are the goals of the Grey College overall? The articles order them to stay out of Empire internal politics, but we've seen several prominent Grey mages influence the Empire towards centralization.
Like your brother, Carl Franz. What about that?
It's really interesting. In our game where we were deeply examining the politics of the colleges, that was the case. The Emperor's older brother, at an early age, had become a witch, contrary to every expectation. He was the one that had been trained up to be the next emperor. And when that occurred, he got whisked away and he joined the Grey College, and he acted effectively as a spy master from behind the scenes, with all of the training to be the next emperor, when Karl Franz himself was the weaker younger brother who was less capable, not really expected to do anything in this particular version of Warhammer, our own personal one. And then he had to then step forward into a job he never intended to do, when he was far more interested in chasing Countess Emmanuel halfway across the Empire. And then he was forced into a marriage that he didn't want. He had a child that he had no desire to have. It all goes wrong through the enemy within, until eventually the Sigmar's hammer itself turns them into the emperor that we knew through the course of Warhammer. And then he very much, in some respects, you could argue, if you want it on a almost basic front, gets possessed by the hammer. He becomes an effigy of Sigmar. He becomes something that's far more than anyone could possibly ever be in many respects, because he personally was a bit weaker. But that was very much that campaign and how it rationalized the various versions of Warhammer that we had. And every time that I look at these various disparate stories, you come up with different solutions for how they could express. And that was one solution. another game will take a different one.
And I think
Good old Franz.
the problem with the Grey College is just actually what we were discussing before, loyalty. So the Articles order them to stay out of the Empire, and they're supposed to obey the Articles, but they are also supposed to be loyal to the Emperor, to the Supreme Patriarch. So if they're ordered by
strictly to the Elector Count,
and to the Elector Count,
we're
right?
the only version that we have available at the moment. Yeah.
I mean, there's what is interfering in politics, right? Like the real human factor, particularly politics that is not really democratic in any sense of the word, right? Like a lot of these magisters are we don't work for them anymore. We can call them magisters
again. We can call them whatever we want.
We can call them magisters again. A lot of these wizards, God, it's so hard to train ourselves out of that. We'll train myself back in magisters. But a lot of these wizards are the relatives of like ranking noblemen. A lot of them are the same is true for the priesthoods as well. And you can like not interfere, but if you're having dinner with your brother, you're going to have a conversation. You know, like you in any situation like that, it's just too murky. You can't have a cast iron. This is what happens, or this is what doesn't happen. It's just not going to happen. You're dealing with human beings, and human beings are incapable of following rules.
It's the truth.
I won't ask you to comment on that, Lindsay.
Please don't. But every human is also, in general, the hero of their own story. So
absolutely,
people 100%. Can rationalize a lot of stuff for that reason. Because if you're sitting down with your brother and he asks you to do something for the family, then strictly speaking, is it interfering with politics, or is it just having family loyalty? You know, like you start to rationalize it, and you start to, and also it's not just someone asks you to do it, someone tells you to do it, and you do it because you're scared, or you do it for reward. Like people have different motivations. So
life is really complicated.
Or you just make a mistake.
Yeah, absolutely. Mistakes are very common.
People panic. They do the wrong thing in the heat of the moment. And
I think there's a very fair point too.
They do. Numerically tiny. Everyone knew everyone else, and I think actually modern elites are pretty small as well.
Yeah. I'm going to add one particular thing about the Grey College, which is alluded to quite strongly in the second edition version, and is loosely lost through third, and is not really picked up in fourth as of yet. And that's that the Grey College has access to arguably the most powerful magic. Now, I don't mean the most powerful as in they can kill more than anyone else. They can do their fair share. It's one of the winds of magic. They can all kill a fair amount. It's that they can remodel what everyone believes around them. Mind magic is arguably one of the most powerful because you can make somebody believe something that isn't the case, which means that you can completely reshape politics. That's why Grey Wizards are very, very carefully chosen, or at least they're supposed to be. It's why Grey Wizards are to a degree feared. It's why they make such good diplomats, arguably. The shadowy shadowmancers are the most political and the ones that everyone would want to be least political because they are capable of refashioning politics around them. They're super dangerous, super dangerous. And there's a reason that everyone wants to lock them away in a college and never bring them back out again. Yes, quite literally, the spin doctors of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay.
And it's like an arms race with Grey Wizards. So once one family gets a way to use them, like the Emperor's brother being a Grey Wizard, everyone has to use them.
Or use a bright magister to kill them. What Grey Wizard?
Yeah, and that's why people fear gnomes, and they've been left undiscovered.
It is.
Darn tootin'.
And was something that I wanted to instill in the gnomes when we added them to 4th edition, to ensure that they not only were capable of surviving. How could they exist in a world where they'd barely been mentioned in various editions? How were they going to fit in and not contradict the existing lore? Relatively easily, as it turns out, because all you need to do is give them shadow magic. That does 3/4 of the job. And the next part was ensuring that they were not human, they were not perceived to be human, and it was easy to attack them and see them as outsiders. The next obvious step was to give them dark magic. Dark magic, which is not in and of itself, if controlled, going to cause any issues. It's just really easy for it to go wrong, and it makes people go wrong if they're not strong-willed or if there's issues at hand, and there's all manner of issues with greed involved with dark magic in particular that the gnomes themselves didn't have. They safely, as much as you can say safely, much like the dark elves, much like the wood elves, something that's often forgot, wood elves don't use just color magic. They use high magic and they use dark magic too. And they're not wandering around being completely perverted, although you could argue that dark magic has been the cause of some of the great hubris of that particular species, some of the mistakes that it has made. And that is a good argument and one that makes for an interesting plot. And similarly, you can lay the same thing down at the gnomes' feet. There's stories there to be told if you wish to use them.
There's a lot of love for the gnomes on Discord if anyone wants to join us. But also, here's a good question. Did Teclis know about gnomes? I mentioned what my headcanon is about gnomes and the Grey College, but... Yes,
absolutely. Not only did he know about them, that's been directly tackled in 4th edition that the gnomes despise him for what he did. The gnomes themselves withdrew and decided that they tried to stay separate to the whole thing. So thus they were on the outside. So Teclis did what Teclis did. The gnomes are not acceptable. And thus we have many an interesting story for conflict there. So
and presumably a lot of the grey magic traditions and spells originated with the gnomes as well. So
absolutely.
So he not only marginalized them, he colonized them effectively, took their stuff and repurposed it for his own imperial ambition. So
you could certainly argue that. I would add that the illusionists, as old Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 1 pitched them, they were mentioned in 2nd edition as well, purely because I thought at one point I might get a chance to write the illusionist witch lore. I dropped little hints for those all over the place because clearly there was something before the colleges came to place. Illusionists made sense as one part of that. At one point for 2nd edition, I was also halfway through writing a book about thieves, and there was another type of witch lore for 2nd edition that was added to that called pocket men. They're basically conjurers that pulled out things and did stuff with them. They were thieves and scoundrels, and they worked in the lower quarters of the empire, and they were all sorts of fun. But again, the older forms of magic that still existed and had been replaced by the Grey College, thoroughly illegal, really shouldn't be touched with a 10-foot long barge pole. But that's exactly the sort of thing that people like, I don't know, a big gang of thieves in that darker quarter of the city are going to be quite happy with.
There's a really good, a brief tangent, there's a really good Roald Dahl short story about someone, I think he calls them fingersmiths, but something like that. Somebody who does the little prestidigitation type thing, and somebody gives him, he's hitchhiking, he gives him a lift, and the whole short story is just that journey. But I'll try and find it. I'll share it in the Discord for people to read. It's a good story.
Yeah, it's a good one.
So why did we spend the whole evening talking about WFRP? Well, aside from the fact that
are we at the end already?
Been spent like that, yes. I
Holy
just wanted
moly.
to say, if you have enjoyed tonight's stream, and if you'd like to support us in the future, we do our weekly streams inside the Rookery. Thank you to everyone who's already supported us. That's
You're the
little
best.
brief plug for
we
that.
love you all.
I do want to come to this comment before we do our little announcement. I think the biggest loss with color magic for me is the idea of casual magic, the illusionist entertainer from the 1st edition core book, the Formation Flying Wizards. Yeah, I
actually completely agree with that. I'll give my little spiel. 100% agreed. It was something that in 2nd edition we were slowly reintroducing, not to overwrite what was there before, but to embellish and to add and to show that Warhammer magic was a deep subject, that at the top had the color magic and underneath it was just a mess. And introducing that mess was half the fun. And 4th edition, to its own degree, it's doing much the same thing.
So this was Beside the Rookery, our little companion stream to our official stream Inside the Rookery. And Andy, I think you have an announcement for some guests.
What do you do? Because I love this one.
Joining us, in which we can discuss all of those thoughts and decisions that came before.
Oh yeah. Okay, so next month, as part of the Inside the Rookery selection of guests and streams, we've got a big one concerning developing Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, where I'm going to be getting together with the developers from 1st edition, Graham and James Wallace, and we're going to also be getting Chris Pramus from 2nd edition, all of the percentile versions of Warhammer, and we're going to get together and have a big discussion about all the challenges that we faced running Warhammer, putting together the rules, and just generally building on something that we all loved, whether it was right from the very beginning where they were literally creating it from scratch, or in my case, someone standing on the shoulders of giants from the previous generations, and trying to rationalize everything that had come from beforehand and turn that into a new game that was both fresh and exciting, but also deeply, deeply respectful of what came before. So I'm super looking forward to that one. That's next month. Check up on our Discord or check on our Patreon, because we'll be putting up posts about that over the course of the next few weeks, when it will be, and I'm a bit excited about it. That wasn't already clear.
Francis is excited too.
You were so excited. You even sneak mentioned it earlier in the stream. I don't know if you realised you did that.
I did. I did.
Oh, thank you.
I did. Oh, thank you very much for just joining our pit. Oh,
Carl Francis,
I love you.
Carl Francis is coming back. We've got the seal of approval.
Marvelous. Just so it's 100% clear, so that we don't miss it, we stream every single week on Saturdays at 7 p.m. UK time. Now, we understand that that's not going to fit absolutely everybody, because let's be honest, we all live in different parts of the world. So we record everything, and we pop them up on YouTube. We also do a variety of other just impromptu streams like this evening, and they're often without planning. They just sort of happen, as in when we're just sitting around saying, hey, we're doing nothing this evening, let's go. If you're on our Discord, you'll definitely know about those. They don't just deal with Warhammer, obviously. Most of us have dealt with Warhammer in the past, so we've got a lot that we can discuss on that subject. But we've all worked on a whole variety of other games. Plus, we know people who've worked on loads of other games too. So you'll find that we could be discussing anything of an Eve. So if you've come to this stream from one of the posts I shared on, say, a Warhammer, I don't know, message group or a Warhammer Discord or something, you'll miss out on all the other ones. So it's worth either coming into our Discord or following our Patreon and just, I mean, it's only £1. Pop up there, drop us £1, and you'll get every update just straight into your inbox. And anyone who does follow our Patreon over the course of the next, I think it's about 3.5 weeks, also gets access to a unique, super spiffy, gorgeous emoji in our Discord. It's only for the early birds for our patrons since it started.
Drawn by the Mark Gibbons.
I think it does deserve the word the
Mark Gibbons.
The Mark Gibbons. For the 4 people out there who don't know who Mark Gibbons is, and I'm actually jealous because you get to go find out. He has done art of all the best kinds for Warhammer through the 90s, and more recent pieces like the discussed gnomes earlier on in this stream. But he's also worked for companies like Riot Games, Blizzard, Sony, et al. He's just amazeballs, and he's doing some rather gorgeous.
Other Mark Gibbons are available, but they're not
pale imitations.
Pale imitations of.
But I don't even know what to say to that.
He did that amazing Skaven from 4th edition as well, didn't he?
Yes, did.
Really good Skaven.
Yeah. For those of you who've got the which book, Rough Night's Hard Days, he did the Skaven in that one as well. It's really gorgeous bit image. And the Morians that are passing through in the Rough Night at the Three Feathers. Absolutely gorgeous picture of Morians. He also did the NPC version in there too, if you want to go check out what his art's like. So yes, we stream every single Saturday.
And hopefully we will see you this Saturday. Speak to you all soon.
See y'all later. Bye.